Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Lisa Heslop, and I'm at the Center for Research and Education on Violence Against Women and Children. We're the hosts of today's webinar on the HELP Toolkit, Identifying and Responding to Family Violence for Family Law Legal Advisors. The webinar that you're about to see has been provided to you with funding from the Public Health Agency of Canada in collaboration with Western University and our Alliance research partners. The webinar is being provided both in English with some simultaneous French interpretation. So you should see a globe icon, next slide please, on your screen that allows you to select the language you prefer to listen to. And the slides are going to be moved both forward in English and in French. So to switch the slides that you, to select the slides that you want to see, you go to View Options at the top of your screen and you'll be able to select either English or French. And if you're having some difficulty navigating this, please put a message in the chat and one of our team will be happy to help you. One exception to this is that we'll be doing this slide walkthrough of the HELP Toolkit only in English, just because it's very complicated to try and work through those both pieces in both languages. So the other thing is that our webinar is going to be recorded in both languages, and it will be posted on the Family Violence Family Law website, along with other webinars that you might find of interest that deal with issues related to family justice and to family law. Your cameras have been turned off, but if you have any questions during the webinar, you can please post them in the Q&A and we'll have time at the end of our presentation to address them. Next slide, please. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional lands that you're currently situated on and invite you to join us in thanking the generations of Indigenous peoples who have cared for these lands and in celebrating the continued strength and spirit of Indigenous peoples. The ongoing work to make the promise of truth and reconciliation real in our communities, and in particular, to bringing justice for murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls across the country should inform our discussions in this webinar and beyond. Next slide, please. Now it's my honor and my pleasure to introduce to you our speakers. Sharmi Wichman is a senior science researcher in the Research and Statistics Division at the Department of Justice Canada. Since obtaining her PhD in psychology in 2001, she's engaged in research at Justice Canada on issues related to family law. She is the federal co-chair of the research subcommittee of the Federal, Provincial, Territorial Coordinating Committee of Senior Officials. I hope you don't have to say that too often. Family Justice, and was the project lead in the development of the HELP Toolkit. We're also joined by Bianca Stump. Bianca works with Sharmi and is a junior researcher. She is a qualitative social science researcher and has graduated with a Master's of Arts in Sociology from the University of Ottawa in 2019. Her research focuses on family law, child and youth victims of crime, and youth justice. Bianca was also a key member of the HELP Toolkit development team. And we also have the pleasure of welcoming Robin Tremblay to our webinar. Robin is a lawyer with the Family and Children's Law team at the Department of Justice Canada. Her work has involved a variety of policy areas, including crime prevention, victims of crime, youth justice, family law, and family violence. Currently, her work focuses on improving the family justice response to family violence. Robin was also a key member of the HELP development team. I'm sure you join me in warmly welcoming Sharmi, Bianca, and Robin.
All right, I'll get started. I just want to start out by saying we're really happy to be here today to talk to you about the Toolkit project. But before I begin, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge that Robin, Bianca, and I are presenting from Ottawa, which is the traditional unceded territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation. So the HELP Toolkit represents the culmination of almost 3 years of work and research, as well as the efforts of many people and organizations across Canada. In fact, I saw multiple very familiar names on the participant list when I looked a few minutes ago. So there are also people on this call and this webinar that had a very important impact on the development of the toolkit, and I thank you for your work again. So as much as this toolkit started and had a 3-year period, much of the research that set the context for this work started earlier, as early as the mid 2000s and 2010, sorry. So this project was led by our Justice Canada team, but was really an effort of so many people. Next slide, please. The HELP Toolkit was launched on our website at the beginning of January 2022, so we've just come up to a year of it being launched. And the development of this toolkit was a key aspect of Justice Canada's work aimed at improving how the family justice system responds to family violence. It's heavily based in research conducted by us as well as others across Canada, and is specifically on the issue of the identification and response of family violence by family law lawyers. This was because there was a huge gap identified through the research in the availability of supports for family law lawyers. So there was supports available for various other professionals, but really nothing for family law lawyers. And research that we had undertaken with a survey that we have on a biannual basis with lawyers and judges identified that many of the family law lawyers didn't regularly screen for family violence in their cases, like in all of their cases, and most of them didn't have a standard tool that they used. So this was one of those gaps. A second piece of key research was a publication that we funded entitled "What You Don't Know Can Hurt You," the importance of family violence screening tools for family law practitioners. So the research team on this, for this project that was headed by Luke's Place, undertook a systematic literature review and analyzed 86 family violence screening tools. And what they found was that there was no universal family violence screening tool for Canadian lawyers who take on family law cases. And that when screening tools are properly used, accurate disclosures of family violence increase. So they can be very useful if used properly. This report made a number of recommendations, including a call for universal screening for family violence by family law lawyers. It also recommended the development of a common tool that could be adapted for use with diverse clients, which is exactly what the HELP Toolkit is intended to be. Next slide, please. So today we're going to briefly talk to you about the approach we took to develop the resource for family law lawyers, and the fact that I think what's going to come across is that we really needed to develop something not only that would be of use to family law lawyers, but actually be used by them. So the role of the family law lawyer and the views of family law lawyers became a very central piece of this work. Next slide, please. As I've alluded to, the toolkit itself involved many moving parts. It drew on work from many areas and undertaken by many different people. Going into the project, we knew that any tool that we developed would need to be voluntarily adopted in the field. It wouldn't be mandatory, and it would be needed to be framed as something that legal advisors could consider incorporating in their practice. So something that could be integrated rather than a whole other structure to put on top of an already busy meeting or busy set of meetings that you'd be having with clients. As as part of this, we began to explore the legal advisor's needs and concerns, and we put a survey in the field that ended up with over 750 responses by family law lawyers, which was a huge response. And they talked to us about their concerns and what was going on in their practices. And we realized at this point that we needed more. We needed more information and background on what family violence is. We needed more guidance for those who had never or seldom addressed family violence in their practice, including on how to ask sensitive questions of clients. There was a lot of lawyers that were coming to this family law without a lot of the understanding and the training around family violence, and that they had a lot of concerns about, will I be able to do this right and well? Will I hurt my clients? So we needed to make sure that that was covered well. And most importantly, we needed to be able to incorporate a trauma and violence informed perspective and to address the importance of cultural awareness and safety. And these areas were and still remain areas that many legal advisors knew or know little or nothing about. So those are pieces that really guided. And also, I think overlaying the whole project was the fact that we didn't need to create something revolutionary or earth-shaking. You know, family law lawyers with a lot of experience with family violence cases were already doing this work, and they were doing it well. And so what essentially we wanted to do was bottle the experience and wisdom of these legal advisors with expertise, mix in a bunch of research evidence on how to approach identifying and responding to family violence, adding a trauma and violence informed perspective and the cultural safety and intersectional approach, and then mix it together and integrate it in some way that it could be understandable when you put it out there and wasn't 4,000 pages long. And it wasn't a small feat, and our collaborators worked very hard with us to end up with a toolkit that is still quite long, but we hope really distilled the knowledge that needed to be distilled. Next slide, please. So just to showcase the breadth and depth of collaboration that this project required, this is not a Department of Justice project. This is really a project really owned by family law professionals and experts and frontline service providers and legal advisors from across Canada. They generally shared knowledge, time, experience, expertise in this area. And, I think that really shows that we had a lot of involvement. So, some of the examples of the group is that we had an advisory group who provided expert guidance throughout the stages of the project. We had a team of subject matter experts, some of who had worked on a very large project called the Vega Project, where they talked about identifying and responding to family violence for in the medical and the social services fields. So a lot of work that had been done there was able to be integrated here. Federal colleagues in the Public Health Agency of Canada and the Department of Women and Gender Equality Canada. Our federal, provincial, territorial colleagues had roles. We invited over 130 frontline organizations to review content of the toolkit when we were at the draft stage. We had more than 60 family law lawyers review the toolkit at multiple points. We really tried to make sure that this was an effort by a community rather than a single entity. So I think, I think at the end of it all, when we had the testing with the lawyers, I think these efforts really came through. They shone through, because when we had interviews and we would be interviewing like a new lawyer who'd barely been in the field, not even a year in family law practice. And I remember we had 2 lawyers like that, and we got on the call with them, and they had the toolkit printed, and they had tabs, and they were talking about how useful all of these things were, and they were flipping back and forth through the document, just saying, how much the guidance and scripts were really helpful to them. And we also had interviews with lawyers who'd been in practice for so long and had so much experience, and they said, really, I'm not exactly sure what's new about this toolkit. It seems to be a lot of what I'm doing already. but what it's doing is reminding me to check back. Like there was always these little pieces that be, oh yeah, it's reminding me I should think about this, or reminding me I should check in with my clients more. So we kind of found that we were able to not only meet the needs of kind of the earlier lawyers or what they're told us, we're also able to kind of replicate or bottle, like we hoped to, what the experienced lawyers were doing. There was no jarring pieces of it, and they did say that they found it useful. So I think, I think that's all I would like to say from that. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, one of the key elements of this work was to incorporate a trauma and violence informed approach and to highlight cultural safety and awareness. We were very aware that this is a really important element of any tool that was going to be talking to people about these very difficult topics, and that lawyers had, for the most part, many lawyers had little training and little knowledge around the area. So we are not the experts in trauma and violence informed approaches and cultural safety and awareness. So we made sure to bring in subject matter experts who could provide that guidance and help to work these materials into the HELP Toolkit in a way that we hoped would be kind of seamless, talking about how to interview, practical tips and guides on how to think about cultural safety, questions you would ask yourself, and how to make sure that your clients were protected throughout these conversations and throughout the process that where the lawyers had the interactions. We not only met with or connected with kind of these experts, we also undertook multiple thought papers from experts in various areas about women with disabilities, newcomers to Canada, people from the LGBTQIA plus communities. So we had these thought papers, and we integrated that knowledge from these 6 thought papers into the toolkit, but we're also going to be publishing a summary. And we're currently finalizing some work with women in gender equality, where we had contractors, experts from the 3 Indigenous communities writing about identifying and responding to family violence in their communities and some of the things that we should be thinking about. So we're still continuing on to kind of layer more of this work on as we go through. We have also a big project with Peter and his colleagues to talk about parenting and family violence. So we're still working at these pieces. It's not ending. We hope to go back and do some more testing and looking at how people are finding the toolkit, where we might need to change. Next slide, please. So now I'll just kind of end up with the reason we ended up with HELP, or why it's called the HELP Toolkit. We realized very early that we would need some sort of acronym, like almost a cheat sheet for people who are kind of coming to this new. And so we ended up, with this acronym that we hoped would help those who are just kind of thinking about what we need to do. And the H is have an initial discussion about family violence, exploring immediate risks and safety concerns, learning more about the family violence to help you determine what you do with your client and what you would recommend, and the promote, which is promoting safety throughout the family violence case. So we ended up, really building the toolkit around this acronym, and we found that it was quite successful. People did like to have that. Next slide, please. Sorry. So you may have noticed that we don't call this a screening tool. And while it's a term that all of us are familiar with, and the concept of screening has been criticized in research in other fields. And based on concerns that the term screening suggests that simply asking a list of questions is enough, which this toolkit is obviously not that. There are questions, but it's also integrated with other areas. So we all know that kind of taking a screening approach can be ineffective and traumatizing to clients. So we avoided those terms to keep consistent with that perception of this as a trauma and violence informed tool that will support legal advisors through the process. I think that's everything. Thank you, and I'll turn it over to Robin to talk a little bit about the family violence provisions.
Thanks, Jeremy. So the HELP Toolkit was developed around the new family violence provisions in the Federal Divorce Act. These were part of the amendments to the Divorce Act that came into force on March 1st, 2021. As I'm sure all of you will know, the Divorce Act now includes a broad evidence-based definition of family violence. So now in the Divorce Act, family violence is defined as conduct by one family member against another that is violent or threatening, that constitutes a pattern of coercive and controlling behavior, or that causes a family member to fear for their safety or for the safety of another person. The definition also acknowledges that if a child is exposed either directly or indirectly to any of these four types of conduct, this exposure constitutes family violence in and of itself. Further, the definition stipulates that conduct does not have to be criminal in nature to fall within the definition of family violence for the purposes of the Divorce Act. Next slide, please. The family violence definition also includes a non-exhaustive list of examples of behavior that constitutes family violence. And these include physical and sexual abuse, harassment and stalking, psychological and financial abuse, and threats to kill or the actual killing of an animal. Next slide, please. I'll just quickly go over some of the other family violence provisions in the Divorce Act. So the new best interest of the child section in the Act sets out a primary consideration. And this provides that the most important thing for judges to consider whenever they're making decisions about a child is always that child's physical, emotional, and psychological safety, security, and well-being. The best interest test also specifically requires judges to consider the impact of family violence on the best interest of the child when determining parenting arrangements. And this includes the impact on the ability and willingness of anyone who engaged in family violence to care for the child. And judges are also required to consider the impact of family violence on the appropriateness of making an order that would require parents to cooperate on issues affecting the child. To help judges determine the impact of family violence, the amended Act sets out a list of specific factors that must be considered. The list includes the nature and seriousness of the violence, the harm or risk of harm caused by it, and whether the family violence causes the child or another child, one of the child's family members, to fear for their safety or for the safety of another person. And I would just note that these family violence factors, along with the definition of family violence, highlight coercive and controlling behavior, which is a particularly dangerous form of family violence and which we often see in the family law context. In terms of other family violence related amendments to the Divorce Act, there are provisions on supervised parenting time and transfers, and on prohibiting removal of a child from a specific geographic area. There are also exceptions to the notice requirements in relation to moves that specifically identify family violence as a basis upon which a judge might decide to modify the notice requirements. And there is also a new duty for judges that is aimed at avoiding conflicting orders and better coordinating proceedings in different parts of the justice system. So now judges are required to consider any current or pending civil protection, child protection, or criminal proceedings or orders related to the parties. Next slide, please. Family violence is relevant not only to parenting following separation or divorce, but also to process decisions that are made in a case. The amended Divorce Act strongly encourages what is referred to as family dispute resolution, such as mediation, collaborative law, and negotiation. And under the Act, legal advisors now have an obligation to encourage their clients to use family dispute resolution, unless the circumstances of the case are of such a nature that it clearly would not be appropriate to do so. The particular circumstances of an individual client's case will determine whether and what type of family dispute resolution would be appropriate. So clearly, family violence has an impact both on the substantive remedies a legal advisor may seek on behalf of the client, and also on the recommendations the lawyer makes in terms of process. Next slide, please. And I will turn it over to Bianca. Thanks.
Thanks, Robin. So as you can see, this slide shows an outline of the key sections of the toolkit. The first section provides an overview about family violence, including different types of family violence, why clients might not disclose, and how client trauma can affect the family law case. The next section is the help guide. It contains detailed information on how to ask about family violence and address risks and safety concerns using the 4 components of the HELP approach. Now, Jeremy described the 4 components a few minutes ago, but if you've already forgotten what they are, don't worry, we will circle back to them in just a little bit. The toolkit also contains a 1-page visual of the HELP approach, along with a short checklist that sets out the key steps and points to remember when identifying and responding to family violence. Next, there is the legal response guide, which offers some points for legal advisors to consider once violence has been disclosed. And finally, the toolkit provides a set of supplemental materials, which are short 2 to 4 page resources that provide more in-depth information on key topics. Now, before we delve into the key aspects of the HELP Toolkit and how it can be used in client meetings, we would like to first show you how to access the HELP Toolkit and how the online version works. So if the current slides can be taken down and then I can share my screen, that would be great. Perfect. And just bear with me here as I set up. Perfect. So the HELP Toolkit can be accessed in a few different ways. So the first is by just typing in the HELP Toolkit into Google, and as you can see, it's the first result that pops up. The other way to access it is through the Department of Justice Canada's website. So there is the tab of Family Law, and now under the Family Law section, there are lots of different resources, and I won't go through all of them, but one of the resources includes resources dedicated to the changes to the federal family laws. And here there's some resources for families and also for professionals. Now, again, I won't go into all of the different resources offered here, but I do want to draw your attention to some free online and accredited training resources for legal advisors. And one in particular is on family violence and family law for legal advisors. And this is something, this is a course that we do link to in the HELP Toolkit, and is something that we recommend that legal advisors take before they use the HELP Toolkit. Now,
sorry, it's Robin. Are you moving through the website? I hear you clicking, but we're only seeing the Google result.
Okay, sorry. Yeah,
Okay.
let me just try just doing the entire. Okay. Does that work? Do you see this?
Oh, yep. Now we see the family law pages. Thanks.
Okay, perfect. So I'll just go back just so that people can see it, because it wasn't noticeable. But as I was mentioning, there's sort of the tab on the changes to family laws. And then once you click on that, you're prompted to either select information for families and information for professionals. For the sake of this walkthrough, we're going to click on information for professionals. And then, as I was mentioning, there's some training for professionals. That's sort of right front and center here. And you can see there's lots of different free online accredited training courses. And the one in particular that I was mentioning was the Family Violence and Family Law for a Legal Advisors course. Now, if we go back to the page here, if you scroll down just a little bit longer, you'll see the HELP Toolkit. And that is one of the other ways of accessing the HELP Toolkit online. So now that we've entered the web page for the HELP Toolkit, there are different ways that you can use the toolkit. So one of the ways is to just save and print the PDF version. So this is the version that has sort of all the really nice designs and the colors. And it's sort of the version that we had intended to be, you know, saved and printed and sort of the final product. Now, when you use the PDF version, there are links embedded into the table of contents. So you can, for example, click on the help guide and be brought to the help guide. There are also links, like hyperlinks embedded within the document. So for example, here there's the tab 6, which is the supplemental material on tips for discussions with your client. Now you can click on this and it will bring you right to that tab. But the only limitation about the PDF version is that there's no way to sort of easily return to the section you were just in. So if you were reading the previous section and you want to go and learn more about tips for discussion with your client before you continued reading, it makes it a little bit trickier to return. Now, our little tip is to either print out or have a copy of the table of contents at your disposal, so that way you could easily navigate the toolkit. So in this case, you know, if I had the table of contents in front of me, or if I remembered the page that I was on, in this case, I remember it, so I can return back to page 15 and I can continue where I left off. So that's a quick overview of the PDF version. Now, if we look at the HTML version, so this is the one online, you can access it by clicking on the table of contents. And here again, there are all these different links embedded. So if you click on any of them, you'll be brought specifically to that section. You can also navigate by clicking next page and previous page. Now, the really nice thing about the HTML version is that we don't run into the same problem that we had with the PDF version. It makes it a lot easier to return to a previous section. So if we were to, you know, look here for a link, let's say the same one that we had clicked on for the PDF version, and we're directed to the supplemental material, we can easily then, after we read it all or read, you know, some information that we find interesting or useful, we can then press the back button, and you return right back to your previous version. So if you are reading the HELP Toolkit for the first time, this might be really useful for you if you do want to access multiple materials at the same time. Now, the other feature about the HTML version, which might be useful to you, is you can download an individual PDF version of different sections. So the current HELP Toolkit is 124 pages. Now, there might be certain sections in the HELP Toolkit that you find particularly useful. For instance, you know, you may access the HELP approach, which is sort of the visual design of the HELP Toolkit. And you might find that it would be very useful for you to print this out and have this on your desk or have this in your office and look at it. And here it's just a one-page document and it's super easy to print without necessarily having to print out the entire 124 pages. Also, this is the individual PDFs can be really useful because there might be some materials in the supplemental materials, for example, like types of intimate partner violence. This is incredibly useful in knowing the context for the entire toolkit and learning this. This may be a resource though that you come back to every once in a while to get a little refresher, but it might not be necessarily something that, depending on your knowledge and experience, it might not be something that you gravitate to on, you know, a daily or a weekly basis. However, you know, depending once again on your preference, your knowledge and your experience, you might find that this tab on representing a client who may have engaged in family violence to be something that you would want to go and print out or save individually. This is a resource that has some example scripts, so some examples of things you could say, which, you know, as we heard from lawyers in the testing phase of the toolkit, they found that to be incredibly useful to have on their fingertips. So that's, once again, just a really useful thing about the HTML version, that even if you don't want to necessarily navigate through the HTML version, the first time you access the HELP Toolkit, you might just want to go ahead and download some individual PDFs that you find particularly useful. So that concludes sort of our little walkthrough.
Bianca, it's Robin. Sorry to interrupt. The interpreters have asked that you speak a little bit more closely to your microphone, and
okay.
also that you just slow down a little bit.
Okay.
Thanks.
Yes, I can do that. Okay, perfect. So now that we've gone through the walkthrough, we want to give you a bit of a sense of how to use the toolkit using a short scenario. So sorry, we can go to the next page. Next slide, perfect. So in this scenario, a new client comes to see you seeking a divorce from their spouse of 10 years. The couple has 3 children, and they all still live together in the family home. The couple immigrated to Canada after their children were born. When you ask generally about the family relationships, the client insists that nothing is wrong. They just want out of the relationship. The client is reluctant to share details, often responds abruptly to your questions, and at times seems somewhat hostile and aggressive. So as we go through the different sections of the toolkit, we'll just keep this in mind, and I'll refer back to it as well. So we can go to the next slide, please. Thanks. So at the outset, we wanted to draw your attention to a few key resources that would be useful to review before engaging in a discussion about family violence. So in the beginning, there is information about the impacts of trauma, which are important to recognize, as clients who have experienced trauma may react or interact in ways we might not expect. For example, in our scenario, the client may seem hostile and aggressive, but it is possible that some of the client's aggressive behavior could be related or linked to their trauma. There's also information about cultural safety, which reflects the fact that clients will have multiple diverse and intersecting identities that can compound their experiences of family violence. So again, if we go back to our scenario, the clients and their spouse's identity as immigrants to Canada may affect how they view and how they deal with family violence. There may also be some cultural considerations that need to be taken into account when representing the client. In addition, the toolkit provides practical tips for safe and effective discussions, including through in-person, email, and virtual communication. So in our scenario, the client still lives with their spouse. So it would be important to keep some of those tips in mind. For instance, if you're having a phone call with your client, it would be important to ask if the client is alone or if their spouse is in the same room, or even if they're at home at the time of the call. The toolkit also stresses that not all clients will disclose family violence to a legal advisor, either on their own initiative or even when asked directly. So for instance, when we go back to our scenario, the client may not disclose initially for numerous different reasons, including there may be some language barriers. They may have a lack of understanding that what they are experiencing is family violence, or they may not view it as relevant to their case. They may feel shame or guilt, or they may feel fear losing support from their family or community. So we can go to the next slide. Perfect. So the HELP toolkit, the HELP approach starts with having an initial discussion about family violence. The toolkit outlines different ways that the topic of family violence can be raised. For example, a client may disclose family violence at the outset, or a lawyer may pick up on potential indicators when asking general questions about the family relationships. The toolkit also suggests ways to ask directly about family violence. So in our scenario, where while there are some possible indicators of family violence, such as the client's reluctance to share details, there weren't really any clear indicators. So in this case, it may be necessary to just directly ask about family violence. So this slide here provides an excerpt from the section on introducing the discussion. It recognizes the importance of normalizing the conversation. So for example, the lawyer could say something like, I would like to talk about family violence. This is something I go through with all my clients to make sure I know about their situation and give the best advice I can. Some people find talking about these issues difficult, but information about safety is really important in family law matters. The toolkit also suggests that lawyers may want to talk about the definition of family violence to help clients understand what they mean, as many people will not understand that this includes non-physical forms of violence. We can go to the next slide. Perfect. The toolkit then provides examples of initial questions that a lawyer can ask if the client agrees to proceed with a conversation about family violence. We have included a few examples on the slide. So for example, have you ever felt afraid of your ex-partner because of something they have said or done to you or to someone else? If yes, can you give an example? Does your ex-partner control how much money you have, tell you what you can spend money on, or make all the decisions about money for your family? Or has your ex-partner ever hurt your children, or have you ever been concerned about their safety? The toolkit recognizes that initial meetings with clients may not allow sufficient time for an in-depth discussion about family violence, and your client may also not be ready to disclose. Developing trust with clients here is key, and talking about family violence is usually a process that will unfold over several meetings with your client. The key here again is to have that initial discussion and make sure to have a conversation about immediate risks and safety concerns with your client. You can go to the next slide, please. Perfect. This brings us to the second component of the HELP approach, exploring immediate risks and safety concerns. The toolkit recommends that legal advisors do this even if a client has not made a disclosure about family violence. So this slide shows a couple of examples of questions a lawyer could ask. For example, do you feel safe to leave my office? Does your ex-partner know you are here? The toolkit provides information about making referrals to appropriate services and about identifying safe ways to communicate with the client. So if we go back to our scenario, it may be helpful to include some referrals to community organizations that would be best placed to help your client. In this case, you could ask the client if they would like referrals to services within their cultural community. It would also be helpful to ask the client about safe communication practices, especially since the client still lives with their ex-partner. For instance, is it safe for the client to take a business card or other documents home with them, or is there a safe place that they can store those documents? We can go to the next slide, please. So the next component of the HELP approach focuses on learning more about the family violence. There are a few sample questions on this slide. So has your ex-partner done or said things that make you feel as if they might hurt you or hurt someone or something you care about? And another form of harassment is posting intimate photos, videos, or inappropriate messages about someone on social media or sharing them in other ways. Have you experienced anything like this from your ex-partner? The toolkit provides several questions for each of these specific examples of family violence in the Divorce Act's definition to get at different potential aspects of the behavior. So this includes physical abuse, sexual abuse, threats, psychological abuse, financial abuse, harassment and stalking, coercive controlling violence, failure to provide the necessaries of life, violence directed at children, and children's exposure to violence. The toolkit also provides examples of questions a lawyer might ask to better understand the seriousness, frequency, and duration of family violence, and to identify patterns of abusive behavior, particularly coercive and controlling behavior. I would note that the toolkit stresses that these questions should not be asked as a checklist. Rather, a lawyer should ask about family violence in a sensitive manner and respond to what their client is telling them. So we can go to the next slide. Thanks. And the fourth and final component of the HELP approach, so if we're going back to that HELP acronym, is about promoting safety throughout the family law case. The toolkit emphasizes that the risk of family violence can change and that separation is a time of increased risk. It recommends that lawyers check in with clients about family violence and safety throughout the case and continue to watch for safety concerns. The toolkit also recognizes that the family law process in itself can increase risk and suggests ways in which legal advisors can help to reduce risks in relation to the process. So for example, when an ex-partner is served court documents, this can lead to increased risk. So in our scenario, since the client still lives at home with their spouse, it is important that the client knows when their spouse will be served to ensure that they and their children are in a safe space. So for instance, maybe they could go to a friend's house or they could visit family members for a weekend. And finally, the toolkit addresses the safety and well-being of legal advisors and their staff, such as safety planning considerations and the need to recognize the impact that exposure to trauma can have on legal advisors. So that gives a nice overview of the HELP approach. I will turn it over to Robin now for the legal response guide.
Thanks, Bianca. So the next section of the HELP Toolkit is the Legal Response Guide, which provides information about various family law options that might be considered. It discusses potential impacts of family violence on parenting arrangements, and it explores other considerations for the family law file, such as litigation abuse tactics, gathering evidence of family violence, and whether a legal advisor should recommend family dispute resolution to a client. There's also some information about criminal law responses to family violence and about dealing with concurrent family law, criminal law, and child protection proceedings. Next slide, please. Finally, as we've already mentioned, there's the set of supplemental materials that provide more in-depth information on key topics, such as a bank of questions to help lawyers ask about specific forms of family violence. This slide and the next slide provide the list of materials. It's a long list, so I won't go through all of them, but as you can see, there's quite a broad range of topics covered. We'll move to the next. Thanks. So hopefully that gives you a bit of a sense of how the HELP Toolkit can be used to identify and respond to family violence. And as Jeremy noted at the beginning, the complete toolkit is very comprehensive and there's a lot of information in there, and it's quite long. However, it's been designed to be used flexibly and recognizes that every case is going to be unique. And the hope is really that legal advisors will be able to draw on the information that they find the most useful in their own practices with their own clients. Next slide, please. Oh, I think we jumped ahead. Go back one. Thanks. So I'm pleased to say that we've received a lot of very positive feedback on the HELP Toolkit since we released it in January. And we thought we would share just a few examples of the types of comments we've received. So one lawyer told us, the biggest takeaway is that it has made me a better lawyer by focusing on family violence and having a way to articulate it with clients. I think I am offering them a better service and I am better able to address their needs. Another told us, the toolkit is very comprehensive and as long as lawyers use it, I think it will be very valuable in helping to provide everyone affected by family violence with a safer future. Next slide, please. And one of our personal favorites is what Justice Chappelle of Ontario's Superior Court of Justice said about the toolkit in both her paper and her presentation for the Carleton County Law Association Annual Institute of Family Law in April of last year, where she said, this toolkit should be mandatory reading for all family law lawyers and judges dealing with family law matters. Reading it could help save a life. Also on the slide, we provided the link to the HELP Toolkit on our website. And we also provided the project team's email address. And if you have questions or comments about the toolkit, you are welcome to direct them to us at the email address provided on this slide. Next slide, please. Before we end our presentation, I wanted to mention just a few of the other activities that Justice Canada has undertaken or is undertaking to support effective implementation of the Divorce Act's family violence amendments and to improve family justice system responses to family violence. So we've delivered training on the amendments to lawyers and other family law professionals throughout the country. And we've also provided information sessions for judges. We've developed a series of free accredited online courses for legal advisors on the amendments, as Bianca mentioned, including the course on family violence and family law. For members of the public, we've published a new fact sheet on divorce and family violence, and this is available on our website in 14 different languages. We've also updated the family violence content in many of our key family law publications, including Making Plans, our Parenting Plan Checklist and Tool, and our children's booklet, What Happens Next. We were really excited that new funding related to family violence and family law was announced in the federal budget in 2021. And this included funding for provinces and territories to provide supervision services for parenting time. There's also funding for projects that assist victims of family violence to access and navigate the family justice system and to improve justice system responses to family violence. And finally, there's a funding component to support access to free legal advice and legal representation for survivors of sexual assault and intimate partner violence in both the criminal and family justice systems. I wanted to mention just one of the excellent projects we've been able to support through this funding. We often hear family violence advocates and victims and others identify the need for additional judicial training on family violence and family law. And in December of 2022, just last month, the Minister of Justice announced that the Government of Canada will be providing funding to the National Judicial Institute for judicial training on family violence in the family justice system. As many of you will know, the National Judicial Institute is an independent, nonprofit, judge-led organization that provides continuing education for federally, provincially, and territorially appointed judges throughout Canada. The funding from Justice Canada will support the development of a national online course for judges on family violence, and in particular, intimate partner violence in the family justice system. And the goal of this course will be to provide judges with additional knowledge and tools to identify, understand, and respond to intimate partner violence and other forms of family violence and family law cases. Again, this is one of many strong projects that we've been able to support through the funding, and I know the work underway in projects right across the country will really help to improve family justice system responses to family violence. So this is the end of our presentation, but Shermy, Bianca, and I would be happy to take your questions. So I will turn it over to Peter, who I understand is going to be the moderator for that portion.
Great, thank you very much, the three of you, for really excellent presentation. There's a lot of material to digest, and I know there's been certainly a lot of circulation of the HELP Toolkit, and I think people are very excited about it. So there's a number of questions, and I think what I'll do is I'll give you the question. I'll leave it to which of the three of you wants to jump in, or maybe none of you. We'll leave it. Tough questions here. There's a general question, and this is one we've heard at previous webinars about lawyers telling clients not to bring up the issue of family violence. They're concerned that raising the issue is going to make things worse. do you have I mean, obviously each case is unique and lawyers will vary in terms of their background and their training and their comfort level. Do you have any reflections about why lawyers may be telling clients not to even raise the issue?
Yes, I think probably everybody does. I think it's a difficult question to answer. I think on the one hand, it's important for lawyers to recognize that the Divorce Act now requires judges to consider the impact of family violence on parenting arrangements. And in addition, we know that judges are required to inquire into other potentially related matters involving the divorcing couple. And this is also aimed at sort of getting at whether or not the case before the family court might involve family violence. In addition to the Federal Divorce Act, the family violence provisions are either mirrored in provincial legislation, or provincial legislation has their own family violence provisions. So, you know, the law requires family violence to be part of the case if it's relevant to the case. On the other hand, and Peter, you can speak to this with firsthand knowledge, and I can't. We know that often family violence allegations are denied, are met with allegations of parental alienation on the part of the parent who is being victimized. So it can be difficult, but at the end of the day, you know, we think it's always important that family violence be brought forward because it's always relevant to what happens in a family law case. So, but I'd love to hear from people from the center on that, because you also deal with this day in, day out.
No, I think your answer really touches on many of the issues. A follow-up question that people raise is the feeling sometimes, and again, we can't speak for judges. We're not here today to criticize judges, but sometimes there's such limited court time, there's pressure to settle cases. So I think sometimes there's a concern that there's not enough evidence for the court to make a finding of family violence. And we have a couple people have written in questions about, you know, to what extent is the credibility of a victim's report when they don't have a police report or other information. That's sort of one of the issues raised both by a survivor in a question here, but also by a lawyer having the evidence. Any thoughts, you know, beyond credibility of the victim? What are the other things that a lawyer may have to present to make the case that it's a credible and concerning circumstance around family violence?
Bianca and Sharmi, jump in at any time. I guess I often feel compelled to say that as officials at the Department of Justice, we don't purport to tell lawyers how to do their jobs. We don't, you know, we're not doing what they do, and they wouldn't really be interested in us giving them, you know, instructions. It's not our mandate. So we have to be a little bit tricky, but what we try to do in the HELP Toolkit is suggest different types of evidence that lawyers may try to identify, and also make sure, you know, that they're conscious of the fact that it's not a criminal standard of proof. You know, so there's kinds of evidence in family law that might be hard to get into a criminal law case, but it's worth maybe giving it a try in a family law case. So it is difficult. We've provided some guidance, but beyond that, I don't think we're best placed to help lawyers with that, other than to say, you know, there's lots of great professional training out there now, more and more every year, I think, and we certainly encourage lawyers to access that.
Right. There's actually a lawyer, there's a lawyer, senior lawyer Carrie Urin, who's written it on the chat function, just reminding us, it's the lawyers, I'll just quote her, it's the family lawyer's duty to prepare well and to push back against frequent unfounded allegations that the survivor or victim is lying. There's many things lawyers can do and should do, and prepare to dispute the myths. So that's just the words of a family lawyer sort of on our chat function, just sort of reinforcing the point.
I'd just like to add something, I think these questions, I've been watching them kind of come through, and they're excellent questions. And I think what we hope for this toolkit had a very narrow scope. It was able to do, or we hope to do, a certain thing with it. But one of the pieces, and the reason we're here today, and the reason that we've been working with various groups and lawyers, is to say that, our piece is a very narrow piece, and these conversations have to be had, and they need to be had with various different groups. So we see this as just a piece of the puzzle. It doesn't answer all the questions, but hopefully gathers things, information together. And I saw some questions about how would other people be able to use like this toolkit, and I think that's where the opportunities are lying with this work. That's we've put together all this work. How could this be applied when there's no lawyer involved? What could be the utility of this work in connecting with the with judges, or judges accessing this work and maybe being able to take it as their own? So I think one of the really important pieces is really what you guys are asking, like what are those key questions, and who can answer those, or how can we bring the right people together to answer them? That's all I'd like to say.
Great. Actually, another comment just on the chat function, just on this question from another senior lawyer, Donna Walk, just saying some lawyers may be advising clients not to raise it in case it backfires. It doesn't mean lawyers don't raise it, but you raise it with care, knowing sort of all the issues. Anyway, so there's lots of interesting comments on the chat function. Actually, one question, and I think Robin, you sort of addressed this with some of the projects that are going on across the country, is a question here about the resources to support lawyers and the court in dealing with family violence allegations. So the general question, what are the resources that are available to the court, to analyze the information and provide supports, such as, for example, supervised parenting time resources and others. So do you have a sense, broad sense nationally on what's happening? I know you have a number of projects, but to what extent are different provinces and territories able to provide resources to complement, these legislative changes and the toolkit?
That's a tricky question to answer. So I guess in terms of for judges specifically, I think it's important to note that because of the independence of the judiciary, governments don't engage in training of judges. However, groups like the National Judicial Institute do publish information in terms of what types of courses they make available to their judges, to judges, I should say. And we know, for example, that their family law course for judges includes content on family violence. And then, of course, there will be the new course specifically on family violence and family law that the National Judicial Institute is developing. So that's really encouraging. In terms of other resources in the family justice system at the provincial and territorial level, I can say that in recent years, family violence has been a really important priority focus for our provincial and territorial colleagues working in this field. And I think every jurisdiction has some interesting resources in place. And we are, between jurisdictions, constantly sharing information about different pilots and so on going on. And I think there's really a lot of good work. And as awareness of need increases, the momentum is really building. So I can't, in this context, wouldn't want to try and get into a detailed discussion of what's out there. But I do think across the country, we're seeing more and more, and it's just so important.
And I think I take it that's sort of one of the suggestions within the toolkit is really encouraging lawyers to reach out to local community resources to support them in their work. Just you might want to is that something you'd want to highlight? Because I think a number of people are asking questions about the sort of the collaborative resources that would be available to help a lawyer, because both before court and after court, I think it would be critical.
Again, sorry, I feel like I'm dominating, so my colleagues can jump in, but we do have in one of the supplemental materials a template, and the idea is that lawyers would fill it out based on what's available in their own communities. But we give them ideas about things that they might want to look for, and we provide some names of more sort of umbrella type organizations where they can go and look for information, and key websites. For example, the Women and Gender Equality Canada has a knowledge center on gender-based violence with links to a lot of really great resources organized on like by jurisdiction. So yes, there is information in the HELP Toolkit on that. I don't know, Bianca or Sharmi, if you wanted to add to that.
I think they're confident in you. I don't know, Sharmi.
No, I think like as Robin said, that it would be a very big undertaking, and we have had conversations with various people about that undertaking to kind of catalog or have some sort of inventory of services that could that people could access. And I think a lot of people, we all think it's a great idea. It's just that doing it and keeping it up is a challenge. And so one of the things that we were encouraging, and that we heard back from the testers as well, is that it's almost better for you to go into your communities and find those resources and make those connections personally, where a list can give you a starting point, but having those connections is where you're going to see the real gold. And understanding your client base and your community, and being able to connect in with the various groups that would have knowledge and be able to talk to you about what is best needed for their clientele. And so I think it's really about, again, we're providing a bit of a framework, we're providing some starting points, but this is where it would be really great if the people using the toolkit then spun that out and explored what's available in their areas. And we did also talk with various people over the time, was thinking about creating small practice groups within your own communities. Maybe maybe there's maybe there's your chapter of the CBA, or there's a chapter of a group that you're active with, and sharing resources within that on a community-based level. Like, there's a lot of ways I think that you could leverage knowledge and resource and create really great communities in your own communities, if that makes sense.
I see somebody has their hand up. Marta, if you could write your question either in the chat function or the Q&A. So at this point, that's the best way to ask questions. So Marta, feel free to just type in the chat. Another question is on early education. To what, and this, you may not have information about this, but to what extent have law schools adopted the HELP Toolkit? Because it strikes me that a good way that people commented to do legal education is to get lawyers when they're young and still eager. Is that something, do you know if there's any uptake from law schools on the toolkit?
Unfortunately, I don't. I think that's a really interesting question. What I can say is that we've been invited to do presentations on the toolkit to a lot of the bar associations and law societies across the country, and to groups like mediators and so on, including in the context of training courses. But whether or not anybody actually in the law schools is using it, I just don't know. but I think it would be great if they did.
Okay. Another question again, I'll refrain from answering this one because I'd like three of you to answer it, but there's a question here about what judges do once there's a finding of family violence. So given if the lawyer has really represented the client well and there's a basis for a finding, how do judges then look at the impact and how to work on a parenting plan, or is there another tool completed by a third party? Because obviously judges, are going to depend on either submissions by the lawyer or by the survivor, or imagine some sort of assessment about what's needed. Any sort of just general reflections about how the information goes from finding a family violence to determining what the impact has been and what's needed.
These are hard questions.
I'm looking for the easy ones for you.
Again, this is something that we attempted to touch on a little bit in the HELP Toolkit, and really stress the importance of making sure, for example, that when assessments are sought, parenting assessments are sought, in a case involving family violence, it's really important to find an expert that is knowledgeable about family violence. It's a specific area of expertise that goes beyond expertise in parenting. But apart from that, I'm not quite sure how to answer that. We do see in the case law that's emerging in the past almost 2 years that judges seem to be, referring to the family violence provisions, analyzing the family violence information that's put before them. We've seen some important decisions coming from high-level courts, including the Supreme Court of Canada in the case of Baron Direct versus Blunis. I'm not sure how to pronounce it, which was a nice surprise, to be honest, because it was a relocation case about admissibility of new evidence, but the Supreme Court seemed to seize on it as an opportunity to talk about some aspects of the Divorce Act amendments, including family violence, and there was some important statements made in that decision that are important for lower courts to be aware of. So I guess I would say I'm encouraged by what we're seeing so far in terms of the attention being paid to what is in the law, and apart from that, I'm not quite sure what else to offer up in terms of how judges actually deal with the information they're given in an individual case.
Okay. And again, this is a question you might want to pass on, but I'll mention it because it's coming up in the chat function, which is the extent to which family violence cases may ever be appropriate for mediation. Obviously, mediation where there's been one of the individuals in chat talked about sort of shuttle diplomacy. You don't have people together in the same room at the same time, but whether mediation would ever be appropriate for family violence victims, especially in the context of where there might be long delays getting, beyond getting an emergency court hearing, there might be a delay getting a court hearing. Again, any reflections? And was that, I'm trying to remind me if that was addressed in the HELP Toolkit.
It is. Again, as the Department of Justice, we don't purport to tell lawyers how to practice law. And we don't come down on either side of family dispute resolution, mediation versus litigation, but we did attempt to set out some considerations and show that there can be benefits to family dispute resolution. As the questioner said, you can arrange for options like shuttle mediation so that the parties don't even need to see each other. And we think that's really important. But then I think, in some cases, there's a sense that you need the formality of the court process and the sort of control of the judicial process and so on to protect the parties involved. So, there's not one right answer, but we as I say, there is some information about that in the toolkit to at least get people to start to think about all of the different considerations.
This is another more broader question, and that's sort of looking at the diverse reality of Canada in terms of urban versus rural settings and, different judges, different access to resources. In terms of the feedback you've gotten so far from the research you've done, any reflections about strategies that evolved in different communities? Again, I'm thinking about, in Canada, you think about urban, rural, and fairly remote northern realities. Any feedback in that area from your research?
Jeremy and Bianca, I think you're well placed maybe to address that, especially in terms of what you might have heard from some of our testers of the toolkit.
Do you want to start, Bianca, with the thought papers, or?
Yes, I can. I'm not sure if the thought papers really touched on it much, but it is something that we definitely heard about when we were testing the toolkit. We did make sure to try to get a representation from lawyers who do practice in more rural areas in Canada. So I think that was really helpful to get that feedback. We did try to include like a few recommendations, especially around safety and risk concerns, because it can be a lot harder for those living in more rural and remote areas to get to safety. And there are, as we know, a lot less community organizations that serve, and it's also sometimes a lot harder to reach those services if, for example, they only have one car or whatnot, without the perpetrator finding out about it. So we did try to provide some guidance around that in the HELP Toolkit. I don't know, Jeremy, do you have anything else to say to that?
I think I just go back to kind of a statement I made before, where the testers, like when we asked them about, how it was going, or we were getting advice when we were developing the toolkit, it was very individual. Certain lawyers we spoke to said, I've got arrangements with a local hotel. And so if I need to get someone out of an unsafe situation quickly, I can, I've done these, I've had these arrangements made. And so I think it, again, goes back to having those connections in the community and having a really good network of people and resources, and really, trying to figure out what other people are doing and that you could kind of build on, or that you could also use. And that's kind of links back to my point around, like, it's going to take a lot of different perspectives to kind of, for us to, make a difference around the family violence and to really help your clients, and, coming together in your own communities and with your own practice groups, and, even friends or anyone who's kind of working in these same areas, and trying to share ideas, and really, really just making it a kind of a community response. I think, those things are really where you're going to see most of your change, because as we've noted, this is very individual, and where your community is, you'll be able to figure out what your resources are, or how to find those resources in your communities, better than other, than we could tell you. One other thing I did note is we talked to several lawyers who tested the toolkit, who are from legal aid, and the legal aid organizations in the provinces, some of them I'm sure all of them have great materials, and they have this great training that they provide to their lawyers. But I'm thinking of one lawyer in particular who worked with the legal aid, who was working in legal aid, but she talked about how that they took some of this information for the toolkit, and then they went out and made new connections, and that they were creating a practice group within their kind of community as well. So I think that's really, not to belabor a point, but that's really where I think you're going to get your best guidance.
Thank you for that. Just one last question, and that's coming back to the training of lawyers, certification of lawyers. And this, again, this is a tricky question. So, Survivors has written in saying, what happens if you don't have a lawyer that practices in a trauma-informed way? Sort of what are the, so this is really from a consumer's perspective, what should be your expectation of a lawyer if you have a lawyer that doesn't really understand family violence or trauma-informed? You know, should you be looking for another lawyer, or you think there's going to be changes in terms of standards of practice or expectations for lawyers working in this field? Maybe a difficult question, but Robin, any thoughts about that?
Well, I think it's important to just explain that the Department of Justice really has no authority over requirements for lawyers. That's something that is determined by individual law societies in each province and territory. So, you know, we can encourage, and I can say that in the course of the HELP Toolkit project, the law societies and their umbrella organization, the Federation of Law Societies of Canada, were terrific partners. They were interested in the project. They were responsive when we asked them to share information. They provided input into drafts and so on. So that was encouraging. I think increasingly, you know, lawyers and their governing bodies are recognizing the importance of training on family violence. And I think that's positive. And I do think there are more and more lawyers out there who are getting that training. And so hopefully it will become increasingly possible to find one. Yeah, I think that's about all I can suggest. Okay. On that. I mean, we do tell people about, you know, lawyer referral services and so on. Every law society in the country offers a lawyer referral service where you can get half an hour or so of free legal advice. Through family violence programs, there's also opportunities to access some free legal advice. So there are ways out there to find the right legal person, but it's a little bit tricky to get into that on this. There's information on our website, though. Maybe that's a good place for someone to start if they're looking for a legal advisor to help them with family violence.
Great, and I just noticed in our chat function, Donna Babs put a link on to trauma-informed lawyering and what should be taught in law school. So again, we've had a lively parallel chat with some of these issues. I think I'm going to turn over to Lisa, but as Lisa comes back on camera and before she makes some final comments and talks about things that are coming up. I just want to thank the three of you for being here, Robin and Bianca and Jeremy. I know how much work has gone behind the toolkit and the HELP Toolkit, and I think it really has stimulated a lot of important discussion. Sometimes the answers aren't as important as the questions, and raising more questions and getting people to collaborate on these very complex issues. And I know that you've certainly supported and encouraged that. I also want to say that just for those of you, just because I've been around the block for 50 years or so doing this work, I also, for people who are watching today, I think there's a limitation to, I think, what anybody, you know, representing the federal government or provincial government can say. So obviously, I just want to recognize that, you know, you can do a lot of work to promote this work and encourage people talking with each other, but there's limitations to how specific you can be about individual cases or telling judges or lawyers what to do or not do. That's clearly beyond your role or mandate. So again, I just want to appreciate the sensitivity with which you answered questions and make sure that all our all our participants understand that. So again, thank you very much, and appreciate everything you were able to share, and also acknowledge the limitations for some of those tough questions.
Sure, I am actually on, but for some reason my video is not enabled. So,
Okay.
So I can, if you'd like to just go forward with our slide, I would like to echo Peter's thanks to our speakers for sharing, you know, so many thoughtful bits and generating great conversations, and our attendees for their questions. These are really important, obviously, conversations that we need to continue to explore. But before I say goodbye, could we just go to the next slide, please? I'd like to talk about some upcoming webinars that are going to be offered through our Family Violence, Family Law project. And the link to our site is posted. On February the 8th, we're going to be hosting a webinar on substance use, coercion, and intimate partner violence, and that will be offered through our Manitoba Sister Research Center. And on the 16th, there will be a webinar hosted by Quebec on domestic violence and immigration issues. And then in the February, we'll be announcing that date specifically, but British Columbia is doing a piece on gender symmetry. And in March, again, the date specifically will be announced. Manitoba is hosting a webinar on traumatic brain injury and family court. And lastly, before we say goodbye, there's going to be a link that's posted in our chat that will send you to our feedback survey. And we really ask that you take a few minutes to complete that survey, because your feedback is so really important to us, and it will help to make sure that these webinars are helpful in the future. So thank you, everyone. I hope you found this to be valuable, and the information will help you as you go forward in your work.